So in other videos, we talked about very briefly alcohol interventions and programs to reduce alcohol and substance use. But there are some final questions and steps that we need to talk about to kind of wrap up this discussion. So, and really the key question is, why don't these work? If you've watched the other videos, the thing I've mentioned multiple times is that even when there's a statistically significant impact of a program, there may not be practical significance. It may not actually change the prevalence of substance use in any particular target group. So why is that? Why don't these prevention programs work? Why don't school-based programs always work? Why don't mass media campaigns work? Why don't family programs always work? Well, one of the reasons might be poor intervention fidelity. And fidelity is the idea that an intervention created in a very strict research environment should be implemented in exactly the same way when it's put out into the field. So a low fidelity study or low fidelity program might only use 2 of the 4 parts originally developed for the program. So it's very low fidelity. It's not using all of the parts which are supposed to work in cooperation with each other to produce an effect. Intervention programs and prevention programs might not work because there's no generalizability. So most of these studies, even though the programs are worldwide, most of the evaluations of these studies have been conducted in the US, and that's biased. That bias is the research, saying if something works here, it may not work in another country, even a nearby country. It may not work in Canada, it may not work in Mexico, it may not work in Western Europe. And that's not counting very different cultures such as Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. So if an intervention is created in the United States or is created in Western Europe, it may not be culturally appropriate for countries elsewhere in the world. It may not an intervention developed in the U.S. may not be culturally appropriate for Brazil or China or Russia or India. And it may not be appropriate and it may not work even if it's a high fidelity program. Even if you take each component that was developed in the research and apply it into a community, because of the cultural differences between where it was developed and the community the program is being implemented in, there simply may be no generalizability. There may be no transfer of effect between those 2 different cultures. Prevention programs might not work simply because we target the wrong population. Maybe the program was developed using young adults, but we're trying to apply it to high school students in the classroom. Maybe the reverse was done. Maybe it was developed using elementary school students, but now we're trying to see if it works in college-age students. We need to make sure we need to go back to what is the outcome we're trying to change. Are we trying to reduce the amount of use, or are we trying to stop people from using to begin with? That's the current users versus the first-time users. And then if we're just trying to focus on reducing current use, are we focusing more on those light users who might have a drink or 2 every once in a while or use marijuana every once in a while? Or are we focusing on those heavy users, the binge drinkers, the hazardous users, the people who are dependent on substances and have a substance use disorder? So all of these need to be asked and answered before an intervention and before a program is actually implemented. And finally, there may not be enough resources to actually pull off the campaign. This is particularly true for mass media campaigns against legal drugs. Obviously, there's no other advertising for illicit drugs. And a good example of this right now is with alcohol. So no matter how much money we put into anti-alcohol, whether that's abstinence from alcohol use or moderate alcohol consumption, into those types of programs and those campaigns, we simply cannot outcompete what is going on and how much money is being spent by the alcohol industry themselves. There are billions of dollars overall being spent. There's hundreds of millions of dollars by each company being spent on marketing alcoholic beverages. We simply don't have the resources to match that level of advertising commitment. And I show you this graph because it's not just a US phenomenon. This is the advertising expenditure for alcoholic products in Germany. There's hundreds of millions of euros being spent in Germany, which is a much smaller country than the United States, on alcoholic beverages. And again, even just in that country, the public health response, the campaign, the mass media campaigns being put in place to try to reduce alcohol consumption can't compete with that level of funding. So ultimately the question is it worth it? And if you have the money and you're willing to be patient, then yes, it is actually worth it to implement some of these programs. So the good behavior game, which I mentioned as a school-based intervention in a previous video, is worth it. It does work, but it costs money. So it costs about $160 per child to implement as a high fidelity program. But it takes 13 years to realize any savings from it. But you can actually save a lot of money. You can save $59 in public health spending on alcohol and substance use per $1 investment. So if you do the math, that's a huge, huge savings by implementing this program. If you implement a life skills training program, so kind of more on the self-esteem level, making people know how to function as adults and people in society, you can save $13 for every dollar you invest. It costs about $100 per child, but you have to wait 11 years to see the outcomes of that. In the Strengthening Families program for 10 to 14-year-olds, that's the age group that the intervention was targeting when it was researched, is very expensive. It's about $1,100 per child. Again, this program, the Strengthening Family program, is very intensive, between 7 and 16 sessions as a family, getting them all together. But it does work. It does save money. It saves about $3.50 to $4 for every dollar invested. So you're getting a savings back of, $3,500 to $4,000 for that $1,100 investment. But it takes almost 20 years to see that savings realized. So if you're doing a program with 10-year-olds, they're going to be almost 30 years old before you see a public health return, before you really fully see your return on investment. So these programs are worth it. They are needed, and they do their job when they're implemented in the right way, when they're high fidelity, and they're implemented on the right target group, and they are culturally appropriate. But you need to be patient. To see the public health impact of these programs will take decades. It won't be a week, it won't be a month, it won't even be years. It will take decades. And that is something to keep in mind when you're developing these programs, when you're evaluating these programs, and when ultimately you're advocating for these programs at a community, a neighborhood, a city, a state, even a national level.